Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening a file that looks at first glance like a pretty standard diplomatic spat.
Right.
You've got a major world leader, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, making a statement about the Horn of Africa.
And on the surface, it's just another headline. Leader A tells region B what to do. I mean, we see it every day.
Exactly. But the sources we're looking at today suggest that this one comment, it's arguably one of the most interesting diplomatic backfires in recent memory.
It absolutely is. It's a story about unintended consequences, forgotten history, and this idea of African diplomatic autonomy.
It's a classic case of the Streisand effect, isn't it?
Oh, completely. Playing out on a geopolitical stage by trying to shut a conversation down, you actually end up handing the other guy a megaphone.
I love that framing.
Yeah.
So the mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. We're going to unpack why a warning from a G20 leader just didn't land as intended.
And in the process, we're going to uncover a legal history about statehood that I think most people, get completely wrong.
And then we'll look at why more and more African nations are starting to say, thanks for the advice, but we'll take it from here.
It's really a detective story about legitimacy.
So let's set the scene. What exactly happened? What did President Erdogan say that kicked all of this off?
Well, to get the comment, you have to get the context. Turkey is a massive influence in Somalia. I mean, billions in aid, infrastructure, military training.
They're heavily invested.
Very heavily invested in the idea of a unified Somalia with its center in Mogadishu.
Right. They have real skin in the game.
Serious skin in the game. So recently, President Erdogan explicitly urged African governments to avoid any engagement with Somaliland. He didn't mince words.
So he was basically telling other countries to isolate Hargeisa.
Yes, exactly. He framed it as a necessity for stability. Basically, stay away for the good of the region.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate for a second. Leaders warn allies about bad actors all the time. The U.S. does it, China does it. Why is this warning so different? Why does our source call it a catalyst?
It's be careful of the target. Somaliland isn't some rogue militia. And by elevating this to the presidential level, by directly telling sovereign African states, don't look over there.
It's like putting up a big sign that says, don't open this door.
Precisely. Your first thought is, what's behind the door? If I tell you, whatever you do, don't talk to that guy in the corner, he's totally irrelevant, your immediate reaction is,
if he's irrelevant, why are you so worried about me talking to him?
Exactly. It implies there's something valuable there that you're trying to suppress. The analysis argues that instead of diminishing Somaliland's position, Ankara's stance, well, it accidentally highlighted the strength of their case.
It signaled to other policymakers that, hey, Somaliland is important enough to worry a major power.
And that makes people curious.
And when you get curious about Somaliland, you hit the history books.
Yeah.
And this is where, honestly, my mind was blown. Before reading this, my assumption was the standard one.
Let me guess. Breakaway region.
That's the one. It's in every news report. It implies they were just a piece of a country that, decided to split off in the chaos.
Like a secessionist movement.
Yeah.
And that is exactly where the misconception is. If you see Somaliland as a breakaway region, you're starting the story in 1991 during the Civil War.
Okay.
But to understand the legal reality and why this all backfired, you have to rewind. You have to go all the way back to 1960.
Okay, take us back. What's the key date?
June 26th, 1960.
And what happened on June 26th?
Somaliland achieved full sovereign independence from the United Kingdom.
Not partial autonomy, but...
Full independence. They were a country, they had a flag, borders, and most importantly, international recognition.
Wait, they were recognized by other countries?
By more than 35 states. The United States Secretary of State sent a congratulatory message. I mean, they were welcomed into the community of nations.
That is a massive distinction. We're not talking about some rebel group declaring independence in the bush.
No, we're talking about a state that was on the world stage, even if it was for a very short time. And that brevity is key. 5 days later, on July 1st, 1960, they chose to unite with the former Italian Somalia to the south.
So it was a choice, a voluntary union.
It was. It was driven by this pan-nationalist, post-colonial dream of a greater Somalia, uniting all the Somali people under one flag.
So they got married.
They got married. But, and this is where the legal scholars in our source material get really animated, it turns out the marriage license was never actually properly signed.
What do you mean by that?
The act of union. The legal document meant to bind the two countries. The source points out it was never fully consolidated or mutually ratified in a way that met the legal standards of the time.
So it was a sort of shotgun wedding?
Legally speaking, yeah, it was hasty. There were different versions of the document in the North and the South. So the Union itself has always been in this kind of legal gray area.
Yeah, that is fascinating. So let's jump forward to 1991. The government in Mogadishu collapses into anarchy. Somaliland declares independence again. The world calls it secession. But based on this 1960 history, that's the wrong word.
The source argues, and I think the legal logic is pretty solid, that it wasn't secession, it was dissolution.
Okay, explain the difference for us.
Well, secession is when I tear a piece off an existing country to make a new one. It violates territorial integrity. That's the big taboo for the African Union.
Right, the Pandora's box of changing colonial borders.
Exactly. But dissolution is different. Dissolution is when a partnership fails and the two original partners just go back to being who they were before. It's more like an annulment than a divorce.
So Somaliland's argument is, we're not creating a new country, we're just dusting off the one we had on June 26, 1960.
That's it, precisely. They are reverting to the borders they held as a sovereign state. They aren't asking anyone to redraw the map. They're asking them to acknowledge the map that already existed at independence.
That single distinction, it changes the entire moral and legal weight of their claim.
It does. It moves the conversation from supporting rebels to acknowledging a historical fact. And this is why Erdogan's comments backfired. By forcing people to scrutinize Somaliland's legitimacy, he inadvertently made them look at this history. And the history is incredibly strong.
But history is only one part of it, right? You can have the best claim in the world, but if your territory is a mess today, nobody's going to recognize you. Realpolitik has to matter.
You're absolutely right. Recognition is always a mix of law and politics. And, when we think of unrecognized states, we picture instability. Warlords, smuggling, gray zones.
Right. The assumption is that without the parent state, everything just falls apart.
But the picture our source material paints of Somaliland is, well, it's the polar opposite of that expectation. This is the second pillar of their case, the institutional record.
So what does that record look like on the ground?
We're talking about 3 decades of stability. And not just no war stability, but functional governance. They have their own currency, their own biometric passports, a police force that actually polices.
And the really big one, elections.
Competitive elections. The source makes a point to emphasize peaceful transfers of power.
Let's just pause on that for a second. Peaceful transfer of power. I mean, that's the gold standard of a functioning democracy. And in the Horn of Africa, that's rare.
It's incredibly rare. You just have to look at the regional context. Somalia to the south has struggled for decades with al-Shabaab, with fragmentation. Meanwhile, Somaliland built a homegrown democracy, mostly without outside help.
Which leads to this deeply ironic point in the source. Opponents, like Turkey in this case, frame engaging with Somaliland as a threat to regional stability.
It's a complete paradox, isn't it? How can a place that has been stable, democratic, and peaceful for 30 years be the threat?
The source calls that framing paradoxical. It argues you can't logically claim a stable, self-governing entity is a destabilizing factor.
If anything, the source suggests the opposite. Somaliland is a net security provider. I mean, think about the piracy crisis.
Oh, right, from the 2000s.
Somaliland basically shut down piracy along its entire coastline. They fight terrorism effectively because the local population actually trusts the government and shares intelligence.
So when an external power says, don't engage with them, it's dangerous, the evidence on the ground is screaming, actually, they're the safest bet in the neighborhood.
And that huge disconnect between the rhetoric of danger and the reality of stability is glaring. It makes the external pressure look less like a genuine security concern and more like, well, politics.
Which brings us to the geopolitics. Why is Turkey doing this? Why spend this diplomatic capital to block Somaliland?
Turkey has a long game in Africa, and a unified Somalia is a major client state for them. They run a massive military base there. They manage the port and airport in Mogadishu. A fragmented Somalia complicates that investment.
So recognizing Somaliland just messes up their map.
It messes up their strategy. But here's the sharp critique the source makes. It suggests that Turkey is making a mistake by becoming prescriptive.
Prescriptive. That's a very polite diplomatic word.
It is. In plain English, it means bossy. It means telling other sovereign states what's good for them.
And our source argues that just doesn't fly.
It argues that strong partnerships are built on respect for local agency. African states are, incredibly sensitive about their sovereignty. After the history of colonialism, they have a deep aversion to outside powers, treating their continent like a chessboard.
So when Erdogan says avoid Somaliland, a diplomat in, say, Kenya or South Africa hears, I know what's best for your neighborhood.
Exactly. And the gut reaction to that is resistance. The source says when engagement becomes prescriptive, it creates caution rather than influence. It backfires.
And it sounds like Somaliland is smart enough to use that. They're not just saying recognize us, they're saying recognize us because you have the right to make that choice no matter what big powers say.
It's a brilliant move. They're aligning their cause with the bigger African desire for agency. They're making themselves a test case for African autonomy.
Let's really dig into that autonomy idea. This feels like the core message of the whole deep dive. It's not just about Somaliland, is it?
No, Somaliland is just the vehicle for the principle. The real question is, who gets to decide foreign policy in Africa? Does Turkey decide who Kenya talks to? Or do African states get to make those calls based on their own interests?
The source actually lays out criteria for this. It says these decisions shouldn't be made through the prism of geopolitical competition. They should be based on merit.
Right. It lists three core things. First, evidence. That's the legal case, the 1960 independence.
Okay, so is it legal?
Second, institutional record. The 30 years of stability, the elections. Does it actually work?
And the third one?
The fundamental right of peoples to determine their political destiny. Self-determination. Do the people themselves want it?
So law, functionality, and the will of the people.
Exactly. The argument is, if a place meets those three criteria, then other nations, especially its African neighbors, should engage based on those facts, not based on whether it makes a leader in Ankara or Washington happy.
It's a call for evidence-based diplomacy.
Which is, surprisingly, not always how it works. But the source argues that, in the long run, ignoring the reality on the ground, ignoring that Somaliland exists and functions, is just unsustainable.
So if we go back to that idea of a union, we said the marriage license wasn't signed. But there's more to it, isn't there? If the union was voluntary.
Then it can be involuntary. That's the heart of the self-determination argument. The source stresses that the Union was a political project, a project that collapsed into genocide and civil war under the Siad Barre regime in the late 80s.
So the contract wasn't just unsigned, it was horribly breached.
In the worst way imaginable. The central government bombed Hargeisa to rubble. They massacred civilians. The argument is you can't force a people to stay in a union that not only failed on paper but turned violently against them.
And that's why the breakaway label is so offensive to them.
Yes. They didn't break away from a legitimate government. They survived a state collapse and rebuilt their own house from the ashes. They see themselves as survivors, not separatists.
That's a vital distinction. You're not supporting rebels, you're recognizing a survivor state that built a democracy.
And that's why the Streisand effect of the comments is so powerful. If you just ignore Somaliland, people can forget the history. But if you attack them, you force everyone to open the history books. And the history books are on Somaliland's side.
So where does this leave the average African policymaker? If you're sitting in a foreign ministry somewhere on the continent, what's the takeaway?
The takeaway is that diplomatic autonomy is real and growing. The source suggests we're in an era where African states are more willing to break with consensus if it serves their national interest.
We've seen that with other issues, right? Like neutrality in the Ukraine conflict.
Exactly. African states refuse to be bullied into taking a side. This is just another flavor of that same assertion of independence. If Ethiopia or Kenya decides a port deal with Somaliland is good for their economy, they might just do it, regardless of the one Somalia policy from abroad.
And that is the nightmare scenario for the status quo.
It is, because once one domino falls, once one major African state engages formally, the taboo is broken.
It creates a permission structure.
Yes. If Ethiopia can do it, why can't we? And the force implies that Erdogan's heavy-handed approach might actually make that domino fall faster, not slower.
Because nobody likes being told what to do, especially in their own backyard.
Never underestimate the power of asserting your own dignity in diplomacy.
Okay, let's wrap this up. We started with a headline about Turkey and Somalia, but we ended up exploring the very nature of what makes a country a country.
It's always deeper than the headline. We saw how a prescriptive warning can backfire.
We debunked the breakaway myth by going back to 1960, that critical week when Somaliland was a recognized sovereign state. We learned about the unsigned marriage certificate.
A key detail to remember.
Yeah.
And we contrasted the lazy narrative of instability with the hard reality of 3 decades of actual governance.
And finally, we pulled back to the big picture, the rise of African diplomatic autonomy. The idea that the future of the continent's foreign policy will be decided in African capitals, not elsewhere.
It's a shift from, permission-based diplomacy to interest-based diplomacy.
That's a fantastic way to put it.
And Somaliland is the stress test for that shift.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on. We often think of recognition as a gift that big countries give to small ones, a stamp of approval. But the source ends with the idea that recognition is really just an acknowledgement of reality.
Right. You don't create the state by recognizing it. You admit that it's already there.
Somaliland exists. It functions, it trades, it votes. So the question isn't, will Somaliland become a state? The real question is, how long can the international diplomatic map pretend that it isn't one?
And will African nations be the first to update their maps?
If they do, it changes the rules of the game forever. That's it for this deep dive. As always, the sources are in the show notes.
It's a fascinating read.
Stay curious, question the narratives, and we'll see you next time.